Hi, welcome back. This is the first presentation on Chapter 8, which is a long chapter because it's dealing with two very important topics, political parties and interest groups. Let's kind of dive in here. These are the key topics. Again, you kept the story. I'm going to assume the rest of this you can read. Again, the fact of the matter is that there are two important topics that are oftentimes treated as separate chapters. That means there's a lot of ground to cover. So again, I'm going to jump right in. Here are the student learning goals. So again, these are the things you're expected to be able to pick up. I'll give you a second to read through these. All right, let's jump in. 2021, Joe Biden becomes president. He has two basic big issues that he's pushing. He wants to have big spending programs on infrastructure, and then he wants to strengthen the social safety net. These were two aspects of what he described as the Build Back Better program. Business interests were very, very aggressive in shaping that infrastructure bill to their favor. But what about ordinary Americans who were hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic? Part of the challenge here is, and this is something that simply, in a democratic society, a mass society with hundreds of millions of people spread out over a continent-sized country, organized, well-financed interests are generally going to have a louder voice in government. And so that is simply a hard reality of American politics. So the two groups that we're talking about here, interest groups and political parties, form what we political scientists describe as intermediary institutions. Now, these are informal political institutions that exist outside the constitutional governing framework established, again, under the Constitution. The three main intermediary institutions of American government include the media, which we dealt with already, and again, whose First Amendment protection is again designed to keep the public informed. Political parties, which are coalitions of different interests who seek to appeal to groups of voters in the struggle to win control for the federal, state, and local legislative and executive institutions through the electoral process. And then interest groups, and these are coalitions of like-minded Americans who join together in common cause to influence the direction of public policy. Political parties and interest groups are these kinds of intermediary institutions. In other words, you've got the formal constitutional branches of government. They have difficulty communicating and to discerning what the will of the public is. And so the media, political parties, and interest groups form this sort of intermediary layer that help funnel interests and information and again, this amorphous thing that we call the will of the people. So again, the problem here is, how do these things, how does the media, how do political parties, how do interest groups kind of funnel that interest? And oftentimes they do so in ways that benefit very wealthy people. So again, which political parties, political parties on the one hand are concerned with the personnel of government, and interest groups are mainly concerned with the policies of government. So, but again, these are both, kind of approaches of influence. So it's important to keep these things in mind. So what are political parties? Political parties' mission is to win elections and control political offices for some factional or ideological purposes. The framers didn't actually envision a formal role for political parties under the constitutional system. In fact, George Washington warned against the baleful, impact of, effect of factions at the time. Parties and partisanship nevertheless organize the political world and simplify the complexities of our constitutional regime, which is incredibly complex for public that oftentimes is not particularly well informed. Again, as one political scientist stated, democracy is unthinkable save in terms of parties. So the United States has a two-party system. Again, the authors of the Federalist Papers and again, first President George Washington warned against the spirit of faction. The Federalist Papers, however, kind of reflected the fact that factions were sort of inevitable. Now, for Washington, his warning against the formation of political parties was motivated by his belief that everyone entering public service should be motivated by what's best for the nation as a whole. That factions were already forming during Washington's term as 2 terms as president is suggestive that Washington was a bit idealistic in terms of how the constitutional system would work. There would not be that many presidents that would command the esteem that he did. If you go through the 40-something presidents that we've had, I would say a significant majority of them were simply ordinary people doing the best they could. They were not by any reach what we might call, great men. So again, it reflects this reality that democracy doesn't always, and in fact, the constitutional scheme that the framers were trying to craft doesn't require great men. It was not supposed to need great men. So due to interpretations of the electoral rules that were kind of vaguely established under the Constitution, a two-party system kind of quickly emerged. And part of it is the Constitution mandates single-member districts with winner-take-all rules, and that leads to a two-party system, something known as Duverger's rule, which is basically to say that if you have a winner-take-all kind of scheme, you're going to end up with two parties rather than a multi-party system. Most other advanced democratic nations employ what is known as proportional representation, where you have to earn a certain number of votes in order to get representation in the parliament. But if you meet that threshold, you get that proportion of the vote. So if you get 30% of the vote, you're going to get 30% of the representation. Likewise, if you get 50%, you get 50% of the representation. So again, that a proportional representation scheme is almost guaranteed to produce multiple parties. And again, depending on the rules, you can get, in some instances, too many parties. If you look at Israel and Italy, those are two examples of multi-party systems where there's so many parties, it's really hard for them to govern. So political parties organize and channel, again, a lot of different voices. One thing that political parties do that's very important is recruit candidates to run for office. So that's a really important activity. Parties want to recruit candidates who are loyal to the party's governing philosophy and who will work to enact the agenda in the event that the party wins control of government. Parties particularly seek to recruit strong candidates for open, competitive congressional seats. Ideal candidates have previous, political experience, high name recognition, and can easily raise large sums of money, and also have a certain amount of leisure time. It's one of the reasons why there's so many lawyers that oftentimes find themselves recruited to run for office. Party organizations generally define how the parties operate. The national committees help resolve conflicts and set the national strategy. So we commonly believe we have a two-party system. In reality, the United States has 50 distinctive party systems where the Democratic and Republican parties have different levels of organizational strength and voter appeal in each state. If you look at on the right side of this slide, you've got the Democratic National and Republican National Committees. They exist to provide some sense of organization, central organization on what otherwise would be a deeply fragmented electoral system. So the DNC and the RNC are supposed to adjudicate disputes between campaigns, and they set the rules governing competition for nominations, especially for presidential elections. So again, if you look at it right now, the Republican Party has basically, the RNC has basically become a creature of Donald Trump. which is, to some extent, that naturally happens when one person wins the nomination. That's kind of what happens, but it's remarkable the extent to which Donald Trump has asserted control over the Republican Party at this early point in the process. If you look side by side again in comparing electoral systems, you're comparing here, the United States and the Netherlands and Mexico. Netherlands has a proportional system. Mexico has a mixed system. And the question is, you look at this slide and look at the kind of the numbers, which system better reflects the will of voters? Do you see any evidence in the data? What do third parties in the United States, why do third parties in the United States have such difficulty winning seats in the legislature? And again, the answer is oftentimes, that they simply, the recognition of voters is that they're wasting their vote, and that even if someone is elected, it's highly likely that they'll simply be ignored within the Congress. So parties, the overall point of parties, of party formation and political parties is to control the government. And for much of American history, American parties, the two parties, were what we call catch-all parties. Catch-all parties are sometimes described as big tent parties. They make diverse appeals to a broad cross-section of the American public. For much of American history, ideology was not a defining feature of American parties. Both Democrats and Republicans into the 1960s had liberal, moderate, and conservative factions within their parties. In the 1980s, the Democratic and Republican parties developed distinctive ideological positions on important issues. The GOP agenda increasingly moved towards reducing the scope of federal government to unlock America's economic diversity. And again, when you think about that, they wanted basically to reduce investment in social welfare and healthcare policies. They want to cut taxes on corporations and the wealthy, protecting the rights of gun owners, reducing the level of immigration into the United States, and increasing military spending, banning abortion, and reducing government regulation on businesses. The Democratic agenda is basically arguing that the federal government can be a force for good and can be used to empower working class and middle class Americans. They want to expand spending on public education and social services. They want a national health care system, increased regulation on government, on business to address climate change, higher taxes on the wealthy and corporations to reduce economic inequality, restrictions on gun ownership, consumer protection programs, as well as support for legalized abortion, and affirmative action to ensure racial, ethnic, and religious and sexual minorities and undocumented immigrants receive equal protection under the law. So again, it's become really sort of a black and white picture when you look within the framework of the two political parties' platforms. They're oftentimes diametrically opposed to one another. That wasn't always the case. Last slide here, factions within the parties. Despite partisan polarization, there are important cleavages within both the Democratic and Republican parties, and they're very important. The Republican coalition is largely comprised of pro-business conservatives, what we might call establishment figures, far-right conservatives, social and religious conservatives, and libertarians. Though there are lots and lots of cleavages that oftentimes have made it very difficult to govern when Republicans have controlled government. The Democratic coalition is comprised primarily of very progressive people, liberals, and then sort of traditional Democrats who are more transactional in terms of what they want out of government. You have, again, in 2016, part of the reason that Hillary Clinton lost was that Bernie Sanders ran a very strong, challenge to her. Again, the Clinton and Sanders factions within the Democratic Party really created a lot of challenges. And, to some extent, Sanders was in the race far longer and again, cost Clinton a lot of support because he was drawing a lot of votes, from what I would characterize as the not Hillary faction of the Democratic Party. And that really produced, a lot of, and it was very difficult to heal those cleavages, and a lot of progressives, frankly, stayed home in 2016, which basically facilitated, Donald Trump's victory in 2016. He won very narrowly in several critical states, especially in Michigan, in Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And those narrow wins in those states that have gone Democratic consistently for the past 40 years really is what cemented his victory, despite the fact that Hillary Clinton won several million more popular votes. So that's it for this slide. When we come back, we will continue discussing the role that parties play in American politics. I'll see you next time.